In Jeremiah chapter 7, we find reflections on improper worship. In many ways, the texts that come to us here in this section detail all of the ways that the people have gone wrong in their worship. You know, the Hebrew word for worship actually involves bowing down to the ground, putting your face, actually your whole face, your nose even, on the ground, falling down before someone. And that act of actually physically bowing down on the ground, bowing down before somebody, is a way of talking about serving them or allowing them to have authority over your life. And so that word, bow down to the ground, essentially becomes the word that is used for worship. So what's happening here in Jeremiah chapter 7 is God is sort of detailing all of the different ways that the people's bowing down, that their worship has gone down the wrong path. Isbell and Jackson say this: section by section, in a downward spiral, the various improper forms of religious practice upon which the people in their perversity have relied are chronicled and even parodied. In this section, item by item, we get all these different forms of rejected worship. In many ways, that's what Jeremiah 7 through the beginning of chapter 8 is really all about. The first form of rejected worship comes right at the beginning of chapter 7. This is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Verse 2. Stand in the gate of the house of the Lord, and there call out this word. Jeremiah is supposed to not make this sort of a private confession, a private prophecy just to a few people. Instead, he's supposed to stand in a very public place and make this message known. It will not be a popular message, which helps us understand why Jeremiah was not that popular during his lifetime. Here's what he's supposed to say. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, who enter through these gates to worship the Lord. There's our word for worship. All who enter to bow down before the Lord. Verse 3. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Correct your ways and your actions, and I will allow you to live in this place. Woodenly, what Jeremiah says there is cause your paths to be good. Cause them to be good. Change the way that you're going and make it a straight path, a path that heads down the way that Yahweh wants, not the path that you want. And I will allow you to live in this place. How offensive, right? God essentially says, hey, if you do this, I'm going to let you live. Right? I can imagine that the people were offended at Jeremiah's statements here. Verse 4. Do not trust in deceitful words. Woodenly, do not trust the words of the lie. You know, Psalm 37 says, trust in Yahweh. Commit your way to the Lord. In Psalm 37, it actually says, roll your way onto the Lord, like you would roll a huge stone over the mouth of a well or over the mouth of a tomb. So you are supposed to roll your way onto the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. And here, the people are not trusting in Yahweh. Here, the people are trusting in the words of a lie. What are the words? What is this thing that they're trusting in? Verse 4. Don't trust deceitful words chanting, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. The first form of rejected worship, I think shockingly, is temple. The very institution that God had created for the people to come in and worship him, God's saying, don't trust in that. Don't allow this to be the form of worship that you hinge all of your hope and all of your trust on. Likely what seems to be happening is the people had developed this idea that the temple meant that they had God's blessing. The temple made them invincible. Golden Gay says this, Yahweh is prepared to let his palace be destroyed rather than have them think that in itself it guarantees their security. And so, if you trust in the temple, that's a deceitful word. That's the word of a lie. Verse 5, instead, if you really correct your ways in your actions, if you act justly towards one another. Again, this is just a repetition of verse 3, but here we're clarifying exactly what this means, that we're acting justly towards others. And Holiday notes that verses 5 and 6 offer three specifics here. We're doing justice to one's peers, right? The people who are at the same level. Then, as it goes on in verse 6, we're talking about the people who are underneath us, right? If you no longer oppress the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, and no longer shed innocent blood in this place. So those who are under you, you're not oppressing them, but also you're going with those above you. Or follow other gods, bringing harm on yourselves. In other words, three levels that you're supposed to enact justice in. And if that's the case, if you do this, then I will allow you to live in this place. Essentially, verses 5 and 6 are a reminder to love God and to love neighbor. Feels like I've heard that before. Love the Lord your God with all that you have. Love your neighbor as yourself. Yes, God says that's what you're supposed to do. Not trust in just the temple. Don't trust that a building is going to somehow keep you safe. Instead, do what I asked you to do all along. I will allow you to live in this place, the land I gave to your ancestors long ago and forever. But look, verse 8, you keep trusting in deceitful words that cannot help. They do not profit. As in Deuteronomy, the promise here, love God, love neighbor, you will live long in the land. That's exactly what Deuteronomy says. That's exactly what God says here. Jeremiah and Deuteronomy have a lot of similarities, and it seems to me that Jeremiah has spent a lot of time meditating on the book of Deuteronomy, the book of the law, and understanding just what God desires of his people. And yet, they've turned away. In fact, verse 9 details some of the ways that they've turned away. Do you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods that you have not known? I mean, this is a violation of at least 6 of the 10 commandments. These 10 commandments were not just given to the people for no reason at all. These were given in order to form the backbone of the community. It was not like the very first, commands that you're supposed to follow. Like, if you don't do any other ones, make sure at least you do these. No, I think instead these 10 were given as sort of the fundamental principles, the underlying foundation for what the community of Israel was supposed to be like. This is the ideal community, a community built on the 10 pillars, the 10 principles that make up the 10 commandments. And now the people have turned their back on that. They're following after other gods. They're refusing to honor their neighbor or love their neighbor as themselves. Verse 10, then do you come and stand before me in this house that bears my name and say, we are rescued, so we can continue doing all these detestable acts. They use their historical rescue, the fact that they were brought up from the land of Egypt, as a reason for them to sin. So we can do whatever we want. And so God says, verse 11, has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers in your view? Yes, I too have seen it. This is the Lord's declaration. God sees it all, and they cannot hide. Jesus uses this very text in his ministry to talk about abuses that he sees of the temple. Verse 12, but return to my place that was at Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 through chapter 4, Shiloh seems to be the central location of worship in ancient Israel. We don't know how it was destroyed, but it seems that around the time that Eli's sons were killed in battle and the ark of God was destroyed, that something happened at Shiloh to devastate Shiloh as a place of worship. And it was never used, it doesn't seem, as a place of worship again. And so God says here, return to my place that was at Shiloh and see what I did because how evil the people were. Verse 13, now because you have done all these things, this is the Lord's declaration. And because I have spoken to you time and time again, but you would not listen. And I have called to you, but you wouldn't answer. What I did to Shiloh, the devastation that they experienced, I will do to the house that bears my name, the house in which you trust, the place that I gave you and your ancestors. I think for the people listening to these words in Jeremiah's day, this is unthinkable. Surely not. Surely God wouldn't actually destroy his own temple. Verse 15, I will banish you from my presence, just as I banished all your brothers, all the descendants of Ephraim. Judah will therefore no longer be before Yahweh, before his place, before his face. And now any superiority that they would claim over the northern tribes, right, the northern kingdom of Israel, has to be removed. Because just as the northern kingdom was exiled, so now also the southern kingdom will be exiled. In verse 16, now, as for you, I think he's talking to Jeremiah here, do not pray for these people. Do not offer a cry or a prayer on their behalf, and do not beg me, for I will not listen to you. This is fascinating. God has a history all throughout the Old Testament of inviting his people into a covenant relationship with him that involves conversation. But here, he essentially bans Jeremiah from pleading for the people or asking anything of God for the sake of this people. God says, I don't want you to talk to me about the people. I don't want to listen to your pleas for help. I don't want you to say anything about this, Jeremiah, because I have decreed devastation for them. He then suggests, verse 17, don't you see how they behave in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? Again, this is not even a secret thing. This is something they're doing in public. Verse 18, the sons gather wood, the fathers light the fire, the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. I think this is the second form of rejected worship here. The Queen of Heaven. Now, I'm not sure who this is. It could be Ishtar, or it could be Asherah, or it could be some sort of syncretistic combo of the two of them. But it seems like what's happening is the people have joined some gods together, or they've developed this belief that there's this queen that they serve, and they've decided to offer all these sacrifices to her. They pour out drink offerings to other gods so that they provoke me to anger. Apparently, worshiping this queen was part of the regular worship of the people in Jeremiah's day. In fact, several times throughout the book of Jeremiah, this same issue, the queen, comes up again and again. Verse 19, but are they really provoking me? This is the Lord's declaration. Isn't it they themselves being provoked to disgrace? Or isn't it therefore the shame of their face? That's what it says, woodenly in Hebrew. You know, the Hebrew word for shame is this Hebrew word boshet. And if you listen, the vowels of that are o-eh. What frequently happens then in Hebrew is sometimes the biblical writers will take pagan symbols or pagan idols or names of deities. And what they'll do is they'll put those vowels for the word shame over top of those. And so it sounds, instead of sounding like perhaps the original name of the god, it actually then sounds like shame. It sounds similar to the word for shame. I think we see this. There's a goddess Ashtoreth that was worshipped in ancient Canaan. And frequently in the Bible, we find it as Ashtoreth. There's the god Melech, or Melech is the Hebrew word for king. And so it seems that there's a king worship, or perhaps this was even the name of a god. Well, frequently it's called Molech, right? Or you see the sacrifice of Tophet. Frequently, this is called Tophet. So what happens all throughout the book of Jeremiah, all throughout the Old Testament really, is the biblical writers, I think, are signaling to us, these people do these things. They offer these sacrifices, but it is all to their shame. So it is their worship of the Queen of Heaven. And so, therefore, this is what the Lord God says, look, my anger, my burning wrath is about to be poured out on this place, on people and animals, on the tree of the field, and on the produce of the land. My wrath will burn and will not be quenched. This will not be to their profit that they worship the Queen of Heaven. This will be to their shame. Just as the idols are torn down, so the people will be torn down. You become what you worship. Verse 21, this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices, and eat the meat yourselves. Now, I think this is a little bit comical. This is almost like God is parodying the whole sacrificial system. He's like, hey, listen, you want to bring your sacrifices? Go ahead, come on and eat as much as you want. Just bring the meat and eat it, right? Verse 22, for when I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offering and sacrifice. Now, that's a little bit confusing to us because we've read books like Leviticus or books like Numbers, where it seems God is very much concerned with burnt offerings and sacrifices. But I think the idea here is more that God was never primarily concerned with just the burnt offering and sacrifice itself. And in fact, I think even in the book of Leviticus or even in the book of Numbers or Exodus or Deuteronomy, if you would say God's primary interest is the sacrificial system, God would say, no, you're not understanding my heart. Moses would say, no, that's not what God intended. God's always been after the heart of his people. He's always been concerned that their hearts serve him and honor him, that they worship him and him alone. And so what's happened is over time, the people have adopted this other form of worship centered around meat. And God says, your sacrifice, your meat, it means nothing to me. Verse 23, however, I did give them this command, obey me, and then I will be your God, and you will be my people. Follow every way I command you, so that it may go well with you. God gave them this word, listen to me. I mean, this is almost the theme of the book of Deuteronomy. Obey me, hear my voice and obey, obey, obey. But the people refuse. Verse 24, yet they didn't listen or pay attention, but they followed their own advice in their own stubborn, evil heart. They didn't turn the ear of their heart to God. They went backward and not forward. Since the day your ancestors came out of the land of Egypt until today, I have sent all my servants, the prophets, to you time and time again. However, my people would not listen to me or pay attention, but became obstinate. They did more evil than their ancestors. This is the story of the people of Israel. And God says, listen, just as I've rejected the temple as a form of worship, just as I've rejected the queen as a form of worship, so also I reject meat as this form of worship. Verse 27, when you speak all these things to them, they will not listen to you, Jeremiah. When you call to them, they won't answer you. So Jeremiah shouldn't worry about non-responsiveness because this is just hardwired into their system. Verse 28, therefore declare to them, this is the nation that would not listen to the Lord their God and would not accept discipline. Truth has perished. It has disappeared from their mouths. Verse 29, go ahead, cut off the hair of your sacred vow and throw it away. Raise up a dirge on the barren heights, for the Lord has rejected and abandoned the generation under his wrath. The word here in 29 for cut off your hair, the word refers to female. It's feminine. And so it seems that we've switched here. We're no longer addressing Jeremiah. God's not speaking to Jeremiah for him to cut off the hair of his vow, but rather this is a word spoken to Lady Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem itself. Go ahead, city of Jerusalem, and cut off the hair of your vow. So what does that even mean? Well, I think the idea is just like in a Nazirite vow, someone who wants to make a commitment to God would grow their hair out, and that hair would be a sign that they were committed, that they had made a commitment to Yahweh. God says, listen, you've gone and broken your commitment. There's no commitment anymore, so why do you keep growing your hair out? Just go ahead and cut it off because your vow means nothing to me. I think that's what's happening here. The message is your vow is as useless as your sacrifice. Verse 30, for the Judeans have done what is evil in my sight. This is the Lord's declaration. They have set up their abhorrent things in the house that bears my name in order to defile it. They have built high places of Topheth and Ben Hinnom Valley in order to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, a thing I did not command. I never entertained the thought. And it's another form of rejected worship. Children. God never asked them to sacrifice their children. This is an abhorrent thought. And yet this is what the people have done. Therefore, look, the days are coming, the Lord's declaration, when this place will no longer be called Topheth and Ben Hinnom Valley, but Slaughter Valley. Topheth will become a cemetery because there will be no other burial place. The corpses of these people will become food for the birds of the sky and for the wild animals of the land. With no one to scare them away, I will remove the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. I will remove from them the sound of joy and gladness and the voices of the groom and bride, for the land will become a desolate waste. God will overturn the land. He will turn the wedding into a funeral. It will be a time of grief. At that time, verse 1, this is the Lord's declaration. The bones of the kings of Judah, the bones of her officials, the bones of the priests, the bones of the prophet, and the bones of the residents of Jerusalem will be brought out of their graves. I don't think this means that God is somehow miraculously raising their bones up out of the graves. I think what's happening is their graves are being dishonored. They're being ransacked. All the people who have been laid to rest are now being sort of brought out, and it's this defilement that's happening nationwide. They will be exposed to the sun, the moon, and all the stars in the sky, which they have loved, served, followed, consulted, and worshiped. I think this is another form of rejected worship, the heavens. In other words, the people of Judah, when they lived, had worshiped these very celestial beings under which now their bones are going to be laid out. Their bones will not be collected and buried, but will become like manure on the soil's surface. You see, the people had, while they lived, chosen to worship these celestial beings. They had worshiped the gods of the heavens, which were not gods, really. God had simply placed those heavenly bodies there to rule the day and the night, but the people had looked to them instead of to Yahweh. And so God says, no, you will not worship them. And in fact, one day your bones will be laid out before them. Verse 3, death will be chosen over life by all the survivors of this evil family, those who remain wherever I have banished them. This is the declaration of the Lord of armies. Here's the deal. God wants proper worship from his people. And in all of these different ways, the people had rejected God. Some of them are surprising. That God doesn't want temple? That God doesn't want meat? Are you sure? It seems like God had requested these things or even asked for these things, but God says, no. If you bring me sacrifices, if you gather to worship in the temple, if your heart is not right, I don't want anything to do with it. But also related to that, you have the queen and children and heavens. You've bowed down to other gods. You've sacrificed your children to other gods, and I want nothing to do with this. And because you've worshiped them, now you are going to be destroyed. You know, our worship matters. It's not just the form of our worship. It's also the heart of our worship that matters. And I think this text helps us see that God cares about the heart of our worship. From the very beginning, from the book of Deuteronomy, from the Pentateuch itself, this collection that begins our Bibles, we can see the heart of God. God was never interested in just the form of worship, the sacrifice itself. God was always interested in our hearts. So perhaps the question we can ask ourselves as we meditate on these texts from Jeremiah, how is your worship? How is our worship? Are we worshiping the Lord in the depths of our heart with all of our lives? Or has our worship slipped into just form? Do we just do it out of routine or because this is what we've always done? Or do we decide to serve the Lord and honor him with all of our lives?